Under the pale light of dawn, the San Pedro River flowed quiet and silver through the heart of the desert. Steam lifted from its cool surface as the sun began to rise behind the red cliffs. The land was still, the kind of silence that came before a story began to move again, before something ancient stirred. The water shimmered like polished glass, and through the drifting mist a young woman stood knee-deep in the river. Her hair clung to her shoulders, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to wash away the dust of a hard journey. She had buried her husband only 2 weeks ago, a rancher lost to a storm and a world that never forgave weakness. Now she was alone, a widow wandering the edge of Apache country, where every sound could mean danger or salvation. The river whispered around her legs, carrying memories of the frontier gunfire, broken wagons, promises that turned to dust. She didn't know that she was being watched from the bluff above, where an Apache leader sat astride his horse, silent and unmoving as the carved rocks behind him. His eyes, dark and steady, studied the figure below with the same patience as the desert itself. He had seen many settlers cross this land. Most brought fear, fire, and blood. But something in this woman's stillness caught him. She wasn't like the others who cursed the land. She looked as though she belonged to it, as though she carried its sorrow in her heart. When the horse snorted softly, she turned, startled, clutching the edge of her torn dress. Her eyes widened when she saw him tall, broad-shouldered, his skin bronzed by the sun, black hair braided and marked with the feather of his tribe. There was power in his stance, but not the kind that threatened. He looked down at her for a long moment, the sun outlining the muscle of his chest, the curve of the scar that ran along his shoulder. Then, slowly, he dismounted, his moccasins barely stirring the sand. The woman's breath caught as he approached, every step echoing against the heartbeat of the river. "You're far from your people," he said quietly, his voice deep, carrying both warning and wonder. The English came rough from his tongue, learned from years of trading and surviving between two worlds. She hesitated, unsure whether to run or speak. Her lips parted, but no words came. She only nodded as if answering a question she didn't understand. He studied her torn sleeves, the bruises on her wrists, the way she flinched at the rustle of wind. "You crossed into our hunting ground," he said, and his gaze softened when he saw her eyes glisten. "You should not be here alone." "I had no choice," she finally whispered. Her voice cracked. The wagon broke near Dry Creek. The others left. I stayed behind. He tilted his head slightly as if weighing her truth. Around them, the air filled with the faint cry of distant coyotes. "This land does not forgive the weak," he said, "but it protects those who respect it." Then, stepping closer, he looked at her with quiet command. "Come with me. You're under my protection now." The words hit her like the sound of thunder rolling over the canyon. Protection? It had been a long time since anyone had offered her that. Her heart twisted between fear and something she couldn't name. She wanted to refuse, to run back to the world she knew, but there was no world left to run to. Behind her were graves and empty land. Ahead of her stood a man whose eyes carried the same loneliness she felt in her bones. He waited, not impatiently, but with the calm certainty of one who knew the desert's pace. "If you stay here," he said, "the men who took your wagon will find you, or the night will." His gaze flicked toward the ridges beyond the river, a warning she didn't understand, but one he clearly did. The Apache had seen the signs of riders moving west, men who burned and looted abandoned wagons. He had followed their trail, and now he knew she was the one they had left to die. She looked down at the water, trembling, then back at him. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "I'm not one of your people." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, toward the horizon, where the cliffs glowed gold under the rising sun. "There are debts older than blood," he said at last. "Your husband's kind took much from mine. Maybe this is one thing I can return." There was something in his tone that made her chest tighten. Not pity, not anger, but an old sadness carried like a burden. She waded toward the shore, her dress clinging heavy with water. He offered a hand, and for a heartbeat she hesitated before taking it. His grip was strong, steady, grounding her like the earth beneath their feet. When she stepped onto the bank, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of horses and smoke. He turned sharply toward the south ridge, his hand instinctively resting near the knife at his belt. "They're close," he murmured. Her pulse quickened. "Who?" the ones you left behind." She froze, her eyes darting toward the horizon. "They wouldn't come back. They took everything. They will come back for you," he said. "They think no one will protect a widow on Apache land." Fear rippled through her, but his calm steadiness held her still. Without another word, he led her through the mesquite trees to where his horse waited. He lifted her onto the saddle with quiet ease, then swung up behind her. The motion startled her. She could feel the warmth of his chest against her back, his arms steadying her as he guided the horse away from the riverbank. The world blurred around them, cliffs, shadows, streaks of morning light. Every hoofbeat echoed like a promise in her chest. For a long while they rode in silence. Land stretched wide and wild, painted with cactus and red stone, where even the wind carried a story. She wanted to ask his name, but something told her it wasn't time. He spoke little, his attention fixed on the horizon. She realized he was scanning for danger, reading signs she couldn't see. The tilt of a rock, the flight of a bird, the scent carried on the air. Every sense of his seemed tuned to the rhythm of the land. As the sun climbed higher, they reached a narrow pass between two cliffs. The air grew dry and still, heavy with tension. The Apache halted the horse, raising a hand for silence. She followed his gaze and saw it, a glint of metal far ahead, the shape of riders against the light. Her breath caught. "They followed," he said lowly, anger flashing across his face like a shadow. He turned to her. "If they find us here, there will be no mercy." She clutched the edge of the saddle, her heart pounding. "Now, what will you do?" "What I must," he replied. He guided the horse off the trail into a narrow canyon hidden by rocks. There he helped her down, his hands firm but gentle. "Stay behind the stone," he told her. "No matter what you hear, do not move." She wanted to speak, to beg him not to go, but his look stopped her. He drew his knife and vanished between the cliffs like a ghost of the desert. The sound of horses grew louder. She crouched, trembling, pressing her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Dust rose in the sunlight, and through it, she saw shadows moving, rough men with rifles, the same ones who had stolen her wagon. Their laughter echoed through the canyon. One of them called her name, his voice cruel and mocking. She felt her stomach twist, then silence. A single hawk cried overhead, and from the shadows, a figure moved, swift, silent, unstoppable. The Apache leader stepped out from behind the rocks, the sun striking the blade in his hand. The riders froze at the sight of him, confusion flickering into fear. From where she hid, the widow's breath caught in her throat. The man who had spoken so calmly by the river now looked like part of the storm itself, fierce, steady, inevitable. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of his voice as he spoke to them in words she couldn't understand. But she felt their meaning, felt the warning in every tone. She didn't know if he would survive what was coming. She didn't know if she would. But as the desert held its breath and the first shot rang out, she understood one thing from the moment he said, "You're under my protection now." Her life would never be the same again. The echo of that first gunshot rippled through the canyon like thunder trapped between stone walls. Birds scattered from the cliffs, and the widow pressed herself tighter against the cold rock, her heart pounding so hard she thought the men might hear it. Dust swirled in the light as more shots followed, sharp and chaotic. The cries of men echoed in the distance. One shouted orders, another cursed, and then came the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. She could not see him, but she could feel the Apache leader moving through the shadows, striking with precision and silence. There was something terrifying and magnificent about it, the way he fought, as if the land itself guided his hands. When the sounds faded into stillness, she waited seconds, dragging like hours. Then a shadow crossed her hiding place. She flinched, only to see him emerge from the dust, his knife dark, his breath steady. His eyes met hers, and in that moment she saw something in them, not victory, not cruelty, but a heavy calm. He nodded once, silently telling her it was over for now. Yet behind that calm was a warning. His fight had only begun. He wiped the blade clean on the sand and knelt beside her. "You're safe," he said quietly, though the words carried the weight of exhaustion. "But we cannot stay." She wanted to ask what had happened to the others, but when she looked into his eyes, she knew not to. He offered his hand, helping her up, and they made their way back to the horse waiting in the narrow pass. The animal snorted nervously, sensing the tension still clinging to the air. She climbed up, her hands trembling as she gripped the reins. He mounted behind her, and together they rode deeper into the desert. As the hours passed, the land began to change. The wide plains gave way to rugged hills, painted with mesquite and juniper. The sun hung low, turning everything gold and red, and though the world looked peaceful, every shadow seemed to carry danger. She dared to speak only when the silence grew too heavy. "You knew they would follow," she said. "You were waiting for them?" "I saw their trail 2 days ago," he answered. They moved like wolves, circling, waiting for weakness. He glanced toward the horizon. "They are not from your town. They travel between towns, taking what they want. The soldiers call them drifters. I call them carrion." "And you? Why were you there?" she asked. "By the river, I mean," he hesitated. "My people once lived by that river. I return when I must remember." His voice softened. "When I must see what we lost." There was something in his tone that made her chest ache. She could feel the history buried behind his few words: burned villages, broken treaties, the long march of survival. "You fight to protect them still?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed ahead to the line of cliffs in the distance. "My camp is there," he said. "The women, the old ones, the children. If the men who followed us learn of that place, many will die." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That is why I cannot let you leave yet." The words struck her like a gust of cold wind. "You think I would lead them there?" "I think they will come looking for you again," he said simply. "And when they do, they will not stop until one of us is dead." His tone wasn't accusing, only certain. "If they believe you are under my protection, they will come harder." Her throat tightened. "Then I've brought danger to you." He shook his head. "Danger walks these lands without invitation." His hand tightened on the reins, and the horse climbed the narrow path winding between the rocks. But sometimes the land decides who belongs here and who does not. By the time they reached the canyon's ridge, the first stars had begun to appear. Below them, small fires flickered in the valley. His camp. She could see the faint movement of people, the glow of embers, the shape of tents made from hides and woven mats. Smoke drifted upward, curling into the cool desert air. The scent of cooked corn and burning sage reached her, bringing an unexpected comfort. For a moment she forgot the fear. As they rode down into the valley, whispers followed them. Children stopped playing, women paused their work, and men standing near the fires straightened, their eyes wary. She could feel their distrust like a weight pressing against her chest. She understood it. She was an outsider, a settler widow brought into a world that had every reason to hate hers. But the Apache leader spoke to them in his native tongue, his words low and commanding. Whatever he said quieted the tension, though not the curiosity. The people stepped aside, letting him pass. He led her toward a larger tent near the center, made from buffalo hides and painted with symbols she didn't understand. Inside, it was warm, lit by a single fire pit. She stood awkwardly as he spoke to an older woman seated near the flame. The woman's face was lined with years of wind and wisdom, her hair streaked with silver. When she looked up, her gaze softened at the sight of the widow. Without a word, she rose and guided her to a woven blanket beside the fire. A bowl of stew was placed before her, corn, beans, wild herbs. The warmth of it filled her shaking hands. "She will see to you," the Apache said. "You will rest here tonight." She looked up at him. "And you?" "I will watch the ridges," he said. "They will not find this place easily, but I must be sure." He turned to leave, and something made her speak. "Never asked your name." He paused by the tent flap, his shadow framed by the glow of the fire. "They call me the Hawk," he said quietly. "It is not my birth name, but it is the one that survived." Then he was gone, his silhouette fading into the darkness beyond. The old woman smiled faintly, motioning for her to eat. "He saved you," she said in slow, careful English. "Few would risk that now." Her tone carried pride and sorrow together, as though she knew the cost of such choices. The Hawk has lost many, yet still he protects. Through the night, the widow lay awake, listening to the sounds of the camp, the soft murmur of voices, the distant cry of a coyote, the crackle of dying fire. Her mind spun with questions. Who were those men that had hunted her? What had they wanted from her wagon? And why did this Apache warrior who owed her nothing risk his people for her safety? Each question tangled with the next until sleep finally came like a slow surrender. By morning, the desert had changed again. The air was cooler, the wind sharp. She stepped outside the tent to find the camp stirring to life. Women grinding corn, children fetching water, men tending to horses. Across the clearing, she saw the hawk standing near the edge of the ridge speaking to two younger warriors. His expression was serious, his hand tracing marks in the sand as they listened. When he turned and saw her watching, he gave a small nod. She walked toward him, the ground rough beneath her bare feet. "We're awake all night," she said. He didn't deny it. "There was movement on the lower trail," he replied. "They are still tracking us. They sent scouts." She swallowed hard. "Will they find us?" "They will try," he said, "but they will not expect us to move." He looked toward the rising sun. "We leave tonight." "Leave," she echoed. "Go where?" He studied her for a moment, then answered, "To the mountain. There's a hidden pass there, a place only my people know. You'll be safe until we decide what to do." His voice was steady. His eyes told another story. He didn't believe safety would last. Not for her. Not for his people. She wanted to protest, to tell him she could not bring more danger to them. But the look on his face silenced her. He had already decided. Still, she asked quietly, "And what about your people? If those men come, won't they attack the camp?" He nodded slowly. "That is why I will send them away before nightfall. Only a few will stay to guard the trail. The rest will take the children north." Her heart twisted at his calm resolve. "You're risking everything for me. For survival," he corrected. "Yours and mine." He glanced toward the horizon. Sometimes, fate ties strangers together for reasons we cannot see. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. She helped where she could, gathering food, filling water skins, learning how to wrap the hides for travel. The people spoke little to her, but they did not turn away either. A few children watched her curiously, whispering and smiling when she smiled back. It was the first kindness she had felt in months. As dusk fell, the camp grew quiet. Fires were covered, horses saddled. The old woman pressed a small pouch into the widow's hands. "Herbs," she said, "to keep fear away." When the hawk approached, he wore a new expression, one of grim purpose. He motioned for her to follow, and they began the slow climb up the canyon path, leaving behind the faint glow of what had been their refuge. Below them, the desert stretched endless, silent, waiting. Somewhere out there, the men who hunted her were still moving, still following. The stars began to appear, scattered like shards of old promises. The wind carried a chill that spoke of coming danger. When they reached the narrow pass, the hawk stopped. His eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and unblinking. "They are close," he said quietly. "I can feel it." She looked at him, fear flickering in her chest. "What will you do if they find us again?" He turned his gaze toward the distant dark ridge and said, "Then the desert will decide who belongs here." The way he said it made her shiver, but the night seemed to listen. And somewhere in that stillness, far beyond the cliffs, came the faint echo of horses approaching, the sound of a storm returning. Night sharpened every sound. The pass breathed cold air, and the rock underfoot felt like old bone. The hawk lifted his head in that still way of his, as if the wind was talking to him alone. The widow hugged her shawl tighter and kept close. The riders were out there on the plain, too far to see, close enough to feel. A low tremor of hooves came and went, then came again. Somewhere behind them, a coyote barked and fell silent, as if warned to keep its news to itself. They reached a shelf where the trail narrowed and bent behind a stack of boulders. The hawk motioned for a halt. He sent one of the younger men ahead with a hand sign, then turned to the widow. His face was calm, yet his eyes held a private storm. She could tell he was counting time the way a hunter counts breath. He pointed to a notch high above. If danger pressed too close, he said, she must climb there and wait. She nodded, though the climb looked steep and cruel. The younger man returned with a whisper. A fire flickered near the mouth of the pass far below. The riders had stopped to rest, or to set a trap, or both. The hawk listened, then drew a map in the dust with a fingertip. There was a dry arroyo that cut around the ridge, a path no horse could use, but feet could. If they took it, they could slip behind the riders and pass unseen, but it would cost them time and blood on their hands from the thorns. He looked at the widow's shoes and frowned. She answered by straightening her shoulders. Time was heavier than pain. They moved like shadows. The arroyo smelled of sage and iron. Thorns tore at cloth and skin. The widow bled in small lines that stung, yet she felt oddly steady, as if the land itself required a toll, and she was paying it with courage. When a branch snagged her sleeve, the hawk's knife freed the cloth in a single neat cut. He left nothing behind that could catch the eye of a tracker. By dawn they had circled the ridge. The riders were small, dark figures on the distant plain, their fire now a scar of ash. The hawk studied them with a hunter's patience, could tell the lead man was no common outlaw. The man read the ground well, kept the others spread and watchful, made signals with his hand rather than shouting. That meant soldiers once, or a scout or a ranch guard turned drifter. The hawk did not like what that meant for the days ahead. They pushed toward the hidden country where the mountain lifted its shoulders to the sky. The trail cut through pines that smelled of resin and rain. It was a relief to breathe the scent, but the relief did not last. The higher air let sound carry. Twice the hawk stopped and listened to echoes that were not their own. The riders were learning the land. They would not rush and fail. They would move slow and steady until the prey made a mistake. The hawk's jaw set hard. He knew this kind of patience. It was his own kind, turned against him. At midday they reached a small basin with a spring. A circle of stones surrounded it, old and dark with years. The hawk knelt and pressed his palm to the ground. His grandmother had told him about this spring. Traders once bargained here. Later, soldiers and chiefs drew lines on paper. Later still, ranchers pushed fences across those lines, and fine words on paper turned to smoke. He said none of this, but the widow watched the sorrow shift through his eyes like a shadow of a hawk passing over sand. They drank. The old woman from the camp caught up with them with two girls who carried bundles. The hawk looked surprised, then troubled. The old woman gave him a look that ended the argument before it began. She told him the camp had already moved north. She had come to help the widow. The hawk bowed his head once, accepting what could not be changed. The girls shared food and kept watch with sharp young eyes. They had seen raids and winters that broke strong men. They respected the widow's quiet grit. One pulled out a scrap of hide painted with a red line ending at a blue mark. The old woman said it was an old sign for water under rock, a marker left by elders 4 times when a group must move unseen and cannot risk fire or talk. The hawk traced the mark and nodded. They would follow the hidden water across the spine of the mountain and come down into a narrow wash that opened to the high plain. If luck favored them, they would reach a cedar grove, where horses could rest without leaving prints. The plan held for a while. There is a kind of grace that comes with a sound plan well followed. The widow kept pace. The old woman hummed a thin song that carried along the rocks and made the girls smile without breaking their watch. The hawk spoke only to warn of loose stone or to point out a raven circling where it should not. The sun bent west. They were close to the cedar grove when a rifle cracked from far off, a single shot that was not aimed to hit but to speak. The hawk raised a hand, and all bodies sank to the ground, as if the earth had tugged them down by a string. Another shot answered from a different angle. The widow felt the message in her bones. The riders were telling one another they had found sign. The hawk's gaze slid to the arroyo below. A strip of damp sand, faint prints of a child's foot, the mark of a waterskin brushed against a stone. He had missed it under the dust hours earlier. The riders had not. They changed course, angling toward broken cliffs where the rock fell in steps. The path was mean and slow. A slip there would twist an ankle or worse. The girls moved like mountain cats. The old woman did not hurry, did not waste a step. The widow breathed through the stitch in her side and kept moving, the sound of hooves rising and falling behind them like a tide that never reached the shore but promised too soon. Near twilight, they made a small shelf, sheltered by cedar and rock. The hawk chose it for a hold. He gave each person a task. The girls gathered juniper berries for a bitter tea that eased thirst. The old woman ground dried corn between stones, the sound steady and calm. The widow picked up a fallen branch and shaved it down to pegs with the hawk's knife as he asked, the motion settling her hands. He shaped those pegs into wedges to jam between stones at the top of a narrow chute. If need pressed, A push would send a rain of rock down a tight cut the riders would be forced to take. It would not stop men who were set on death, but it would slow them and force them to show their faces. As they worked, the old woman told a quiet story for the widow. Long ago, she said, there had been a raid by soldiers after a treaty feast. The hawk had been a boy then. He had pulled a child from a burning lodge and carried her through smoke so thick it made the world go away. The child lived and grew to be a woman who bore a son with a laugh like a stream in spring. That son had been taken last winter by fever that swept the valley. The old woman's voice shook once. The widow saw that the boy with the laugh had been her grandson. The old woman had learned to keep sorrow quiet, but it lived with her like a shadow that never left. The hawk kept watch over such shadows, not because he could banish them, but because he knew their weight. The widow told a story in return, not to compare grief, but to lay truth down on the same ground. Her husband had been a kind man when the world was kind. Drought had turned him hard. Bankmen came to count cattle with cold eyes. A fence went up where an old trail used to run. She had tried to keep the home from falling apart with busy hands and brave words, but one storm night he rode out to save strays and did not come back. No one stole him, no man to blame, only the land and the bad luck that ties itself to good people. After the burial, the drifters came, pretending to help with the wagon, then taking everything and knocking her down when she begged for the family Bible. She did not tell the part where shame had almost choked her. She did not need to. The old woman's eyes told her the rest had been understood. Dusk gathered. With it came a new worry. The younger of the two girls who had laughed at thorns earlier now sat pale and quiet, pressing a hand to her side. When the old woman lifted the girl's shirt, there was a bruise spreading, deep and ugly. The girl said it was from a fall on the rocks. The hawk's face grew tight. Moving her through the night would be pain and risk. Staying would be risk of a different kind. He walked to the edge of the shelf and looked down the dark throat of the pass where a narrow ribbon of sky still held light. He stood a long while without moving. The widow joined him. She could feel the choice weighing on him like a stone on a scale. She understood scales. Town men had measured her worth with them since she was a girl. This was a different kind of measure, but it dealt with lives just the same. She said nothing. She only stood with him and watched the last of the light draw a thin line across the far ridge. Soft whistle floated up from the shadows below, 3 notes spaced like steps. The hawk answered with 2, quick and low. A figure rose near the base of the cliff, a scout from the camp. The man climbed with easy hands and gave a report in the tongue of the tribe. The widow could not follow the words, but she read the faces. The riders had split. One group had circled high to cut off the cedar grove. Another had ghosted along the lower trail where the prints were. A third shape moved to the east, not with the riders and not against them. A hired tracker, the scout guessed, working for silver and not for a flag. The hawk asked a question that carried a hard edge. The scout answered, and shame pulled at his mouth. The tracker was not a stranger. Years back, the tracker had ridden with soldiers who broke a winter camp under promise of peace. The scout's brother fell that day. The tracker wore a red scarf to remind himself of nothing but luck. The scout wanted to take that scarf, and the man's breath with it. The hawk put a hand on his shoulder. Not tonight, not for anger. Tonight was for clear thinking. They prepared to move again. The old woman bound the girl's ribs with a strip of softened hide and herbs that smelled of bitter mint. The widow took half the girl's load. The hawk turned the wedges of wood in his hands one last time, then wedged them firm and set a cord across the top stones. If a rider stepped where he should not, his weight would pull the cord, and the stones would do the rest. It would not kill, the hawk said, but it would make noise and dust, and by steps. They started toward a crack that slid behind a slab of rock like a slim door. The hawk went last, setting his feet where prints would blend with goat tracks. The moon had not yet risen. The world was a bowl of dark velvet with a rim of cold stars. Far below, the riders lit a small fire against the law of good tracking, just enough to heat coffee and keep men from turning mean against each other. The hawk almost smiled. Men who let comfort speak are easier to read. They were almost through the crack when a small sound froze every spine. It was not a shot, not a shout. It was the sound of a pebble skipping where no one had put a foot. The hawk spun, knife in hand, and stared into the dark below. He saw what no one else could see yet. A figure stood on a ledge across the chute, still as a stump. The figure wore a hat brim low and a scarf like a line of rust. The tracker lifted a hand and gave a little ironical salute, as if tipping a glass in a saloon after a deal well made. No one moved. The tracker did not lift his rifle. He only set a small mirror to his chest and caught the last streak of light from the west, sending a silent flare down the valley. It was a signal, bright for a blink, gone for the next, yet loud as a bell to men who waited for such signs. The widow knew without being told that the riders would turn their heads as one toward that brief flash and come running like wolves at meat. The hawk took one slow breath. He studied the ledge, the distance, the shape of the rock above the tracker's head, the old seam that ran across it like a scar. He could reach that seam with one throw. Or he could gather his people into the crack and risk a scramble in tight stone with a wounded girl. He could leap across and fight a man who smiled, while 36 hooves thundered closer. He did none of those things yet. He stood with the knife low and his eyes high and waited for the smallest shift of the tracker's weight. The night tightened, the air thinned, the cedar needles went motionless. And from far off, the first rush of hooves rolled up the canyon like wind before rain, the wind carried. The sound of the approaching hooves, faint but steady, like a drumbeat echoing through the bones of the canyon. The hawk didn't move. His eyes locked on the tracker's silhouette across the gap, the faint shimmer of the man's red scarf flickering in the half-light. The widow felt her stomach twist as she realized the trap was already closing. They were surrounded by stone and night, no easy way out, and the men hunting them were too close to outrun. The hawk's hand tightened around the knife, but he waited, silent, calculating distance and time. He knew one reckless move would give away their position and doom them all. Then a tracker stood perfectly still, waiting, almost amused, as if daring him to move first. The widow could feel her heartbeat in her throat. Behind her, the old woman pressed a hand against the younger girl's mouth to keep her from crying out. The sound of hooves grew louder, and with it came the faint click of metal rifles being loaded, horses snorting, voices calling low. The canyon walls began to tremble with the vibration of it. The hawk's eyes shifted briefly toward the narrow passage where the others hid. He knew he had to buy them time. One mistake now, and they'd be caught between stone and death. Then, with a motion so smooth it felt like a shadow breaking free, he raised his arm and hurled the knife. It cut through the darkness, spinning end over end until it struck the seam of rock just above the tracker's head. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the seam split with a crack, and a shower of stone burst from the cliff. The tracker dove aside as boulders crashed down, filling the gap with dust and sound. The hawk turned instantly. "Go," whispered sharply, pushing the widow toward the narrow path. "Don't stop. Follow the old one." The group scrambled into the crack of stone, crawling through the dark as the canyon behind them roared with falling rock. The widow's hands burned on the rough surface, her knees scraped raw, but she kept moving. The passage twisted like a serpent, squeezing tighter until she could barely breathe. Behind her, she heard the hawk's voice again, low but steady, guiding them through. She couldn't see him, but she felt his presence calm, controlled, unbreakable, even as chaos raged behind them. When they finally spilled out into open air again, the world had changed. They were higher now, looking down over the valley where torches flickered like stars on the move. The riders were climbing fast, following the trail of dust kicked up by the landslide. The hawk emerged last, covered in dirt, breathing hard but still alive. He took one look at the horizon, then pointed toward a dark ridge ahead. "That way," he said. "There's an old mine above the cedar grove. They won't find it in the dark." The old woman nodded and took the wounded girl's hand. The widow turned to follow, but hesitated when she saw the hawk wasn't moving. He stood watching the canyon below, where the riders were spreading out, calling to one another. "They'll reach the lower pass before dawn," he said quietly. "We won't be far enough by then. You can't fight them alone," the widow said, her voice trembling, but firm. He looked at her, the faintest smile breaking the edge of his face. "I don't plan to fight," he said, "but I can slow them down." The words sank into her like a knife. She stepped closer. "Saved me once already. Don't throw your life away." He didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at his hair, carrying the scent of smoke from below. "There are times when a man doesn't choose his fight," he said finally. "The land chooses for him. Before she could say more, he handed her a small bundle, his satchel filled with dried food and water skins. Take them north. When the morning star rises, follow its light. We'll lead you out of the mountains. If I don't come, don't wait. Then, without another word, he turned and began climbing back down toward the canyon. The widow stood frozen, torn between fear and something deeper that she didn't understand. The old woman's voice broke through the storm in her chest. He walks with the desert now, she said softly. If you try to stop him, he'll be lost, and so will we. They moved again, climbing toward the ridge where the old mine waited, hidden in shadow. The trail wound through stone and thorn, narrow enough that they had to go one by one. The stars above seemed closer than ever, cold and sharp against the black sky. The widow's mind replayed his last words again and again, each one a blade cutting deeper. Every sound from below, the echo of hooves, the distant cry of a rider, felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Down in the canyon, the hawk crouched behind a broken outcrop, watching the torchlight move closer. The riders had split into two groups, one climbing the slope, the other circling through the lower path. He could see the tracker again, brushing dust from his coat, red scarf still bright against the dark. The man called out to his followers, his voice low and confident. The woman's with him, he said. The bounty's worth double now. The chief wants her alive, him too, if possible. Don't risk the prize. The hawk listened carefully, his jaw tightening. Oh, so there was a bounty. Someone had sent these men, someone powerful enough to pay for blood. He thought of the woman's husband, of the land she had lost, and of the towns that thrived on taking what didn't belong to them. This wasn't random violence. This was ownership disguised as justice, and he knew that story all too well. He moved quietly through the rocks, setting small traps as he went, loose stones balanced to fall, sticks placed to snap beneath careless feet. The moon climbed higher, lighting the canyon in silver. The riders' torches flickered as they reached the edge of the pass. The hawk's muscles coiled. Could hear their laughter now, the sound of men too sure of themselves. The first of them stepped over the hidden cord, and the wedge trap released. Stones thundered down the slope, sending men and horses scattering. The hawk used the chaos to strike, moving fast and silent. A blade flashed in the moonlight, a rifle fell, and another man cried out before the sound was swallowed by the wind. But for every one that fell, two more appeared. The tracker barked orders, rallying them, his rifle scanning the shadows. The hawk ducked behind a ledge just as a shot tore through the air, splintering the rock above his head. The sound was deafening. Dust filled his lungs. He rolled, grabbed a fallen rifle, and fired back. The echo shook the canyon walls. Above them, the widow heard the gunfire. She stopped, turning toward the sound, her heart racing. He's still down there, she said, her voice breaking. The old woman gripped her arm. If you go, you die too, she warned. He knew this when he stayed. The widow tried to pull free, but the old woman's strength was steady, unyielding. The living must carry what the dead cannot, she said. The words cut deep, but the widow forced herself forward. The path steepened, and by the time they reached the mine, dawn was beginning to stain the horizon. The entrance was half collapsed, covered in ivy and old timbers. The hawk had been right, no one would find it easily. Inside, the air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of dust and iron. They lit a small lamp, its glow trembling against the walls. The wounded girl lay near the entrance, her breathing shallow but steady. The old woman sat beside her, silent in prayer. The widow stood near the mouth of the cave, staring down at the valley below, where smoke still rose from the canyon. She could see the flicker of torches moving again, slower now, searching. Somewhere among them, the hawk still fought, or hid, or bled, she didn't know. But she felt him alive in the movement of the wind, in the sound of the ravens circling high above. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, from far below, came a sound faint but unmistakable. A single, sharp rifle crack, then silence. The widow's knees gave out, and she sank against the wall, covering her face. The old woman came to her side, her voice low. The sun has not risen yet, she said. Until it does, we do not mourn. The first light crept over the ridge, painting the cliffs gold. The widow wiped her tears, her heart heavy but defiant. She would wait. The hawk had promised to come before dawn, and until the desert spoke otherwise, she would believe him. But even as she watched the valley, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was shifting below, that the fight wasn't over yet, and that the storm still gathering in those shadows was far from finished. The sun climbed slow over the jagged ridge, turning the sky from gray to gold. The widow waited by the mouth of the old mine, her eyes fixed on the valley below. The desert looked peaceful now, washed in morning light, but that calm felt false. The smoke had faded, and the echo of gunfire was long gone, leaving behind a silence that carried too many questions. Her hands trembled against the rough stone as she searched for any sign of movement. Part of her mind told her to let go, to accept what she feared, yet her heart kept whispering that he was still out there, somewhere among those cliffs. The old woman moved quietly behind her, tending to the wounded girl. The younger one had survived the night, her breathing steadier, color returning to her face. The older woman crushed herbs and fed her small sips of water, working with the calm of someone who had seen too much to waste words. When she finished, she looked toward the widow and said softly, "He told you to follow the morning star. He meant to live." The widow nodded, though her throat ached too much to speak. Hope was a strange thing in the desert, fragile but stubborn enough to survive where nothing else could. As the hours passed, the light grew harsh. The widow forced herself to eat a small piece of dried corn and share water with the others. The silence between them was filled with the creak of the wind against the wood beams, the shifting of stone, the faint cry of an eagle far above. Every sound made her listen harder, expecting his voice. Then, when the sun was high and heat shimmered off the rocks, she heard it, a single call from below, low and rough, like a coyote's cry turned human. The old woman's eyes lifted, and without a word, she nodded. The widow ran to the edge of the cliff and looked down. At first, she saw nothing but sand and shadow. Then, from behind a ridge of red stone, a figure appeared. He was moving slowly, his steps uneven, but it was him, the hawk, his bare shoulders streaked with dust, his hair tangled and dark with sweat. One arm hung against his side, the other gripping a rifle by the barrel. Relief hit her like a wave. She shouted his name, but her voice caught in the wind. He looked up at the sound and raised his hand in a weary salute. She ran down the narrow path before the old woman could stop her. The descent was steep, the rocks hot underfoot, but she didn't care. When she reached the base, she found him leaning against a boulder, his breath shallow but steady. Blood marked his arm and side, but the wound had been bound roughly with a strip of his own shirt. He smiled faintly when he saw her. "I told you to go north," he said, his voice hoarse. "You didn't tell me to forget you," she answered. He looked at her a long moment, then laughed, a dry, tired sound that somehow made the desert feel alive again. She helped him to his feet, her shoulder under his arm, and together they climbed back toward the cave. Every step felt heavier than the last, yet every one carried the weight of survival. When they reached the entrance, the old woman came forward, her eyes scanning his wounds. "You walk like a man who fought death and made a deal," she said. He nodded slightly. "The tracker is gone," he said. "He took his payment in pride and left it on the rocks. The others scattered when their fire ran out." He looked toward the valley. "They won't come back. Not here." The old woman began cleaning his wound with steady hands, muttering words under her breath that sounded more like prayer than medicine. The widow sat beside him, holding the water skin, watching the dust of the morning drift across his face. "You could have died," she whispered. "Why risk it for me?" He looked at her, his eyes soft but tired. "I saw what they took from you," he said. "And I saw what they wanted to take from my people too. The same greed, the same hunger. When I saw you standing in that river, I saw someone who refused to kneel to it." He paused. "And maybe I wanted to see if there was still something worth saving." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither could untangle. She turned her face away, blinking back tears she hadn't let fall since the day her husband died. For the first time, the grief didn't feel like a chain. It felt like soil turning over before something new could grow. They stayed in the mine through the heat of the day, resting in shifts, patching wounds, and waiting for the sun to soften. When evening came, the hawk stood again, slower but determined. The others packed their things, and together they began their journey north. The land unfolded before them in shades of red and gold, endless and empty, but no longer cruel. The widow walked beside him, and though neither spoke much, the silence between them felt alive, like something understood without need for words. As they traveled, they passed the places where their paths had first crossed, the river that shimmered under dawn, the cliffs that had hidden their escape. The hawk stopped once, kneeling to touch the ground. "My people will return here," he said quietly, "not to fight, but to live again." He looked toward her. "And you, what will you do when we reach the border?" She thought for a long time. "I don't know," she admitted. "There's nothing left of my old life. The land is gone, the town would turn me away, and the past doesn't feed anyone." Then she looked at him, her voice steady. "Maybe I'll build something where no one can take it again. Maybe that's what freedom means now." He smiled faintly. "Then you understand the land better than most who were born on it." They walked until the sun fell low and the air turned cool. When they made camp, the stars came out clear and sharp, stretching over them like a roof made of fire and memory. The old woman sang softly while the girls slept. The widow watched the flames flicker and caught the hawk staring into the distance, lost in thought. She moved closer, her hand brushing his arm. "You said once the land decides who belongs here," she said. "Do you still believe that?" He nodded. "The land remembers who respects it. It doesn't forget kindness or courage." He turned toward her, the firelight dancing across his face. "You belong here now." The night passed quietly, and by morning, they reached the edge of the high plains. The air smelled different there, wilder, open, like the world was beginning again. They could see the first signs of grass returning after the rains, and in the distance, smoke from a small settlement rising gently into the sky. The old woman smiled, her eyes full of relief. "We can rest here," she said. "The land is kind beyond this ridge." The hawk looked at the widow. "'Tis where I leave you," he said. She stared at him, disbelief flooding her chest. "Leave," he nodded. "My people are waiting. I must lead them back home before the next moon." God. The land needs rebuilding, and the stories need telling again. He looked at her with quiet affection. "You are part of that story now." Her throat tightened, but she managed to smile. "And if I want to find you again?" He reached for her hand and pressed a small stone into her palm, smooth, marked with a single carved line. "Follow the river east when the moon is full," he said. "If the wind still calls your name, you'll know where to go." His hand lingered for a moment before he turned to mount his horse. The old woman and the girls watched silently as he rode away, his figure growing smaller against the rising sun. The widow stood long after he was gone, the stone warm in her hand. She felt the ache of parting, but beneath it was something new, strength. The kind that came from surviving, from finding purpose beyond pain. She looked toward the open land and whispered to herself, "I belong here too." The words felt right. Weeks later, settlers passing through the northern trail spoke of a woman building a small homestead near the Cedar Ridge. They said she lived quietly but never seemed afraid of the wild. Sometimes at dawn, travelers claimed to see her standing by the river, looking toward the east, her hand clutching a small carved stone. They said she smiled, as if the wind was speaking her name. And somewhere far beyond the cliffs, where the red earth met the sky, a hawk circled above a campfire, its cry echoing through the valley, a sound of freedom, of survival, and of two lives that had crossed in the harsh beauty of the old American frontier. The desert held their story now, carved into its silence, where time itself could not take it away.